Join Marple the Clue Crafter for Miss Marple's brilliant mystery solutions.
In the shadowed halls of Thornfield Manor, a grand celebration turns deadly when the lights flicker out and a scream pierces the night. Lady Eleanor Ashby lies dead, a silver candlestick stained with her blood. Who struck her in those 12 seconds of darkness? Was it the heir with a grudge, the fiancé hiding a shadowy past, or the silent archaeologist with secrets buried deeper than his Egyptian tombs? Join Miss Jane Marple with her sharp eyes and sharper mind as she unravels a web of lies, hidden keys, and whispered betrayals. Will the truth emerge before another life is lost? Step into the mystery, where every clue counts and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Thornfield Manor. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, where the village lay nestled like a contented cat, its thatched cottages and tidy gardens basking in the warmth. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her window with a piece of fine lacework in her hands, gazed out at the familiar scene. Her sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, flickered with quiet curiosity as she observed young Tommy Pierce delivering the post. There was something in his gait, a certain haste, that piqued her interest. "Something is afoot," she murmured, her needles clicking softly. The post brought an unexpected letter, its creamy envelope embossed with the crest of Thornfield Manor, a grand estate some 20 miles distant. Miss Marple slit it open with a silver letter opener, her movements precise. The invitation, penned in elegant script, was from Lady Eleanor Ashby, a widow of considerable means and impeccable reputation. She requested Miss Marple's presence for a weekend gathering to celebrate the engagement of her nephew, Charles Ashby, to Miss Viola Redmond, a young heiress of striking beauty and uncertain origins. The guest list promised a constellation of notable figures: a retired colonel, a fashionable novelist, a door solicitor, and a mysterious archaeologist recently returned from Egypt. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had met Lady Eleanor once, years ago, at a charity bazaar, and had noted her gracious but guarded demeanor. An invitation from Thornfield, she mused, and yet there is a shadow behind the words. Her intuition, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life, sensed an undercurrent of unease. She folded the letter and placed it on her writing desk, resolving to accept. After all, a gathering of such diverse characters in a grand manor was precisely the sort of occasion where secrets might unravel. The journey to Thornfield Manor was uneventful, though the winding lanes and ancient oaks lining the estate's drive filled Miss Marple with a sense of timeless intrigue. The manor itself, hair swept into an elegant chignon, her smile warm but tinged with strain. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Lady Eleanor said, her voice smooth as polished mahogany. "I do hope you'll enjoy our little celebration." "I am certain it will be most illuminating," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling with gentle mischief. The drawing room was a study in opulence. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a roaring fire, despite the mild evening. The guests were already assembled, their conversations a low hum punctuated by the clink of sherry glasses. Charles Ashby, the bridegroom-to-be, was a handsome man of 30, with a boyish charm that seemed at odds with his restless eyes. Viola Redmond, his fiancée, was a vision in pale blue silk, her auburn hair cascading in waves, though her smile faltered when she thought no one was watching. Colonel Reginald Bantry, a bluff, red-faced man, with a penchant for regaling others with tales of his Indian campaigns, stood by the fireplace, his booming laugh filling the room. Beside him, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, a novelist, whose sensational romances had made her a fortune, adjusted her peacock feather hat with a theatrical flourish. Mr. Percival Grimsby, the family solicitor, hovered near the bookshelves, his thin lips pressed into a perpetual frown. Finally, Dr. Leonard Fairfax, the archaeologist, leaned against a window, his dark eyes scanning the room as if deciphering an ancient text. Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, and observed. There was a tension here, subtle but unmistakable. Charles avoided his fiancée's gaze. Viola's fingers twisted a lace handkerchief. Colonel Bantry's joviality seemed forced. Mrs. Wentworth's laughter was too shrill. Mr. Grimsby's eyes darted to the door, and Dr. Fairfax's silence was almost predatory. Even Lady Eleanor, the perfect hostess, betrayed a flicker of unease as she glanced at the grandfather clock, which struck 7 with a mournful chime. Dinner was announced, and the party moved to the dining room, where a long mahogany table gleamed under candlelight. The meal was exquisite: roast pheasant, creamed potatoes, and a delicate syllabub, but the conversation was strained. Colonel Bantry dominated with a story of a tiger hunt, while Mrs. Wentworth peppered the table with witty barbs that landed a little too sharply. Viola spoke little, her eyes fixed on her plate, and Charles drank more wine than was strictly polite. Mr. Grimsby mentioned a recent codicil to Lady Eleanor's will, his tone dry as dust, and Dr. Fairfax murmured something about the curse of a pharaoh's tomb, which drew nervous laughter. As noticed Viola's hand tremble, spilling a drop of wine, and Charles' forced smile. She saw Mr. Grimsby's fingers tighten around his fork, and Dr. Fairfax's eyes narrow ever so slightly. Colonel Bantry coughed, and Mrs. Wentworth's laugh was cut short by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. It was then that the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A woman's scream pierced the silence, followed by a heavy thud. When the lights returned, Lady Eleanor lay slumped at the head of the table, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. A thin trickle of blood seeped from a wound at her temple, and a silver candlestick lay on the floor beside her. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. "Dear me," she said softly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It seems we have a mystery on our hands." Chapter 2. The Shadow of Death. The dining room at Thornfield Manor was frozen in a tableau of shock. Lady Eleanor Ashby lay motionless, her silver hair fanned across the polished table, the crimson stain at her temple stark against her pallor. The silver candlestick, its base smeared with blood, gleamed accusingly on the floor. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking the hour at precisely 8:47 p.m. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table, folded her knitting with deliberate care and placed it in her bag. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, took in every detail: the overturned wineglass beside Viola Redmond, the rigid posture of Charles Ashby, the Colonel's flushed face, Mrs. Wentworth's trembling hands, Mr. Grimsby's sudden stillness, and Dr. Fairfax's inscrutable gaze. "A tragedy," she murmured, her voice soft, but carrying an edge of steel. "And yet, not an accident, I think." Colonel Bantry was the first to break the silence, his military instincts kicking in. "Good God, someone's killed her," he bellowed, striding to Lady Eleanor's side. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, then shook his head. "Dead. Stone dead." His voice trembled, betraying the bravado. Viola let out a stifled sob, clutching Charles's arm. "Oh, Charles, how could this happen?" Her voice was high, almost theatrical. but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the candlestick, then away. Charles, pale and unsteady, disentangled himself from Viola's grasp. "We must call the police," he said, his voice hoarse. "And a doctor, though. It's too late for that." Mr. Grimsby, the solicitor, cleared his throat, his thin frame rigid with disapproval. "Indeed, Mr. Ashby, but we must touch nothing until the authority—" Calculating as her own. Mrs. Wentworth, her peacock feather hat askew, fanned herself vigorously. "This is monstrous! To think we were all sitting here and someone... Her words trailed off into a gasp, her eyes wide with the thrill of drama. Miss Marple rose quietly, her small figure commanding attention despite her unassuming demeanour. "If I may suggest," she said, "we should move to the drawing room. The staff must be informed and the police summoned. But first, let us ensure nothing is disturbed, as Mr. Grimsby wisely advises." The butler, a stooped man named Hawkins, was summoned, his face ashen as he took in the scene. He confirmed that the telephone lines were functioning and promised to call the local constabulary at once. The guests, shaken but obedient, filed into the drawing room, where the fire still crackled, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze sweeping the dining room. She noted the precise placement of the candlestick, 2 feet from Lady Eleanor's chair, and the angle of her body, which suggested she had been struck from the side. The tablecloth was undisturbed, save for the spilled wine near Viola's place. A single pearl earring lay near the candlestick, glinting faintly. "Interesting," Miss Marple whispered to herself, committing every detail to memory. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Colonel Bantry paced, muttering about cowardly attacks, while Mrs. Wentworth perched on a sofa, scribbling notes in a small journal, no doubt gathering material for her next novel. Charles and Viola sat apart, he staring into the fire, she twisting her handkerchief into knots. Mr. Grimsby stood by a bookcase, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm, and Dr. Fairfax leaned against the mantel, his silence more unnerving than the other's agitation. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting resumed as if nothing had occurred. "While we await the police," she said, her voice calm, "perhaps we might establish a timeline." The lights went out at 8:47. As the clock chimed, "Dr. Fairfax, you said 12 seconds elapsed. Did anyone move during that time?" The question hung in the air, met with uneasy glances. Colonel Bantry stopped pacing. "I was reaching for my glass," he said gruffly. "Didn't move an inch." I may have stood," Viola admitted, her voice trembling. "I was startled by the scream." Charles shot her a sharp look. "You didn't mention standing, Viola." "It was chaos," she protested. "I don't recall exactly." Mrs. Wentworth waved her fan. "I was seated naturally." "And the scream," she said. "Did it come before or after the thud?" A pause. Viola spoke first. "Before, I think. It was so sudden." "No," Dr. Fairfax countered smoothly. "The scream followed the thud. I am certain." The contradiction hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "How curious," she said. "Memories can be so unreliable in moments of shock." The sound of gravel crunching outside announced the arrival of the police. Inspector Crawley, a stout man with a bristling moustache, entered with 2 constables, his expression grim. He surveyed the drawing room, his gaze lingering on Miss Marple, whom he recognized from a previous case in St. Mary Mead. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod, "I might have known you'd be in the thick of it." "Merely a guest, Inspector," she replied demurely. but I am at your service." Inspector Crawley took charge, ordering the dining room sealed and the guests to remain in the drawing room. He questioned each in turn, his notebook filling with alibis and contradictions. Miss Marple listened, her knitting a rhythmic counterpoint to the halting voices. She noted that Charles claimed to have been seated, yet his chair was slightly askew, as if pushed back in haste. Viola's earring was missing its mate, and Mr. Grimsby's cufflink bore a faint stain, wine perhaps, or something darker. Colonel Bantry's bluster seemed to mask a deeper unease, and Mrs. Wentworth's theatricality felt rehearsed. Dr. Fairfax, meanwhile, offered precise details, but no emotion, as if reciting a script. As the inspector concluded his initial inquiries, Miss Marple leant forward. "Inspector, might I suggest examining the candlestick closely? Its weight and position may tell us much. And perhaps the pearl earring on the floor. It may belong to someone in this room." Inspector Crawley raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "We'll look into it, Miss Marple. You've a sharp eye, as always." As the police moved to the dining room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind racing. The earring, the candlestick, the 12 seconds of darkness. These were the threads of a tapestry she would unravel. A crime of passion, perhaps, she mused, or one of cold calculation. Either way, the truth lies in the details. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Curiosity. The drawing room at Thornfield Manor retained its oppressive air as the clock ticked past 10, the fire's glow casting long shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic precision, but her eyes were alert, darting from one guest to another. The police, under Inspector Crawley's direction, were still in the dining room, cataloguing evidence and murmuring in low tones. The guests, confined to the drawing room, shifted uncomfortably. Lady Eleanor's invitation had been too deliberate, her words too carefully chosen. A celebration, she had called it, yet the atmosphere had been anything but festive. Miss Marple's mind turned to the village parallels she so often drew upon. Old Mrs. Cleary, for instance, who had invited the vicar to tea just before revealing a family scandal. People invite one for a reason, she thought, and it is rarely just politeness. Inspector Crawley re-entered the drawing room, his moustache twitching with the weight of his findings. "The candlestick is indeed the murder weapon," he announced, his voice clipped. "A heavy blow to the temple delivered with force. The earring Miss Marple mentioned belongs to Miss Redmond, I presume?" His eyes fixed on Viola, who flushed and touched her ear where the remaining pearl gleamed. I must have lost it in the confusion," Viola stammered, her fingers trembling. "I didn't notice." Charles Ashby's jaw tightened. "You were standing, you said, near the table?" Viola's eyes widened. "I told you, Charles, it was dark. I was frightened." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Miss Redmond," she said gently, "did you perhaps reach for something in the dark, a glass or the candlestick?" The question was soft, but it landed like a stone in still water. Viola's lips parted, but no sound came. Colonel Bantry coughed loudly, breaking the tension. "Preposterous! The girl's no murderer. Probably some servant with a grudge." "Indeed, Colonel," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But we must consider all possibilities. The darkness hid much, but not everything." Inspector Crawley, sensing the undercurrents, turned to the group. "I'll need statements from each of you, starting now. Miss Marple, if you'd be so kind as to join me in the library, I'd value your observations." Miss Marple inclined her head, gathering her knitting bag and following the inspector. The library was a cavernous room, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a faint scent of old paper mingling with cigar smoke. A large oak desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with papers and a silver inkstand. Inspector Crawley closed the door and turned to her. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple," he said, not without respect. "What do you make of it so far?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly. "It is early, Inspector, but the facts are suggestive. Lady Eleanor was struck during those 12 seconds of darkness, as Dr. Fairfax so precisely noted. The candlestick was close to her, within reach of anyone at the table. The scream, however, is curious." "Unclear. I would also suggest examining the candlestick for fingerprints, though I suspect the killer was careful. And the wine stain on Mr. Grimsby's cufflink? It may be innocent, but it bears scrutiny." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You don't miss much, do you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, one learns to notice the small things. A misplaced teacup, a glance too long held. These often tell the story." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. Hawkins, the butler, entered, his face pale. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we've found something in Lady Eleanor's study. A letter, half burned in the grate. It's troubling." The inspector and Miss Marple followed Hawkins to the study, a smaller room off the main hall, its walls adorned with family portraits. A fire smouldered in the grate, and among the ashes lay a partially charred sheet of paper. Crawley retrieved it with tongs, laying it carefully on the desk. The handwriting was Lady Eleanor's, the ink smudged but legible in parts. "Cannot continue. Betrayal. Charles must know. The will." The rest was consumed by flame. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A letter of such import, burned so hastily," she said. "It suggests Lady Eleanor feared discovery, or intended to reveal something." Crawley frowned. "Charles Ashby, you think? Something about the engagement?" "Or the will," Miss Marple said softly. "Mr. Grimsby mentioned a codicil at dinner. It may be worth inquiring what changes were made." The inspector sent for Grimsby, who entered with his usual air of disapproval. "The codicil," he said when questioned. "A minor adjustment made last week. Lady Eleanor wished to secure a portion of her estate for charitable causes. Nothing untoward." "And who benefits otherwise?" Miss Marple asked, her voice deceptively mild. Grimsby hesitated. "Charles, primarily, and Miss Redmond upon their marriage. But the codicil reduced their share slightly. It was contentious." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm in her mind, though her hands were still. "Contentious," she repeated. "How interesting." Back in the drawing room, the guests were growing restless. Colonel Bantry was expounding on the unreliability of modern electrical systems, while Mrs. Wentworth whispered to Viola, who looked close to tears. Charles paced by the window, and Dr. Fairfax watched it all with the same detached intensity. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind sifting through the fragments. The earring, the candlestick, the burned letter, the codicil. Each was a thread, but the pattern was not yet clear. As the clock struck, "House among these people. We need only look closely enough." As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the fire. She thought of her neighbour, Miss Hartnell, who had once hidden a letter in a fit of guilt only to betray herself by a nervous glance. "Someone here is hiding more than grief," she thought. and I shall find them out. Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The morning after Lady Eleanor Ashby's murder dawned grey and heavy. The sky over Thornfield Manor shrouded in mist that clung to the estate's ancient oaks like a mourner's veil. Inside, the drawing room was subdued. The guests gathered in uneasy silence as the police continued their work. Miss Jane Marple, seated by a window with her knitting bag at her side, observed the group with her customary quiet intensity. Her hands moved deftly, the needles clicking softly, but her mind was far busier, piecing together the fragments of the previous night's tragedy. Inspector Crawley had set up a temporary headquarters in the library, and now he began the formal interviews, summoning each guest in turn. Miss Marple, with the inspector's reluctant permission, sat in a corner of the room, her presence unobtrusive, but her attention razor-sharp. "I shall merely listen, Inspector," she had assured him, her eyes twinkling. "One never knows what a pair of old ears might catch." The first to be questioned was Charles Ashby, whose haggard appearance suggested a sleepless night. His tie was slightly askew, and his hands fidgeted as he sat across from Crawley. "I don't know what happened," he said, his voice strained. "One moment we were toasting, the next, the lights went out, and then she was dead." Crawley leaned forward, his notebook open. "You were seated next to your aunt, Mr. Ashby. Did you hear or see anything during those 12 seconds of darkness?" Charles shook his head. "It was chaos. Viola screamed, I think. I reached for her hand, but I don't know. It all happened so fast." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And your chair, Mr. Ashby," she said gently. "It was pushed back when the lights returned. Did you stand, perhaps, to assist Miss Redmond?" Charles flushed. I may have. I don't recall exactly. I was startled like everyone else." Crawley noted this, his moustache twitching. "And your aunt's will? Mr. Grimsby mentioned a codicil?" What next? Her auburn hair was pinned up, but a strand had escaped, giving her a slightly dishevelled look. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. "Miss Redmond," Crawley began, "your earring was found near the candlestick. Can you explain that?" Viola's fingers touched her bare earlobe. "I told you. I must have lost it in the dark. I stood up when the lights went out. I was frightened. I might have brushed against the table." "And the scream?" Miss Marple interjected softly. "You said it came before the thud. Yet Dr. Fairfax believes it was after. Can you be certain?" Viola hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. I think it was before. But it was so sudden. I can't be sure." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "A scream is a memorable thing, Miss Redmond. One does not easily mistake its timing." Viola's cheeks flushed, and she looked away. Crawley pressed on, asking about her relationship with Lady Eleanor. "She was kind to me," Viola said, her voice trembling. "She welcomed me as Charles's fiancée, though I sensed she had reservations." "Reservations?" Crawley asked. Viola twisted her handkerchief. "She asked about my family, my background. I'm an orphan, you see. My parents died when I was young, and I was raised by a guardian in London. Lady Eleanor seemed curious about it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed.
In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young woman, Lily Bates, whose vague past had hidden a secret marriage. Curiosity, she thought, can be a dangerous thing. Next came Colonel Bantry, his bluster somewhat subdued. "I was at the far end of the table," he said gruffly. "Heard the scream, then the thud. Didn't move a muscle." "Damned cowardly way to kill someone in the dark like that." "And your opinion of Lady Eleanor?" Crawley asked. "A fine woman," Bantry said. "Bit too soft-hearted, perhaps. Always giving money to causes, orphans, hospitals, that sort of thing. Not that I disapproved, mind you." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You mentioned a grudge, Colonel, last night. Do you suspect anyone in particular?" Bantry's face reddened. "Just a figure of speech, Miss Marple. Servants, you know, always listening at keyholes. But I've no evidence." Mrs. Clara Wentworth swept in next, her peacock feather hat replaced by a more subdued velvet cap. "This is all quite dreadful," she declared, settling into the chair with a flourish. "But I assure you, Inspector, I was seated the entire time. I heard the scream. Definitely before the thud, and then the lights came."
If she knew something they didn't. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And your notebook, Mrs. Wentworth? You were writing in it last night. Observations, perhaps?" Mrs. Wentworth laughed, a touch too brightly. "Just ideas, Miss Marple. A writer's mind never rests. Though I did note the time. 8:47, when the clock chimed. It's a habit." Mr. Percival Grimsby followed, his thin lips pursed. "I remained seated," he said curtly. "I heard the thud, then the scream. I saw nothing unusual." "And the codicil?" Crawley asked. "You said it was contentious." Grimsby's eyes flickered. "Charles was displeased. He felt Lady Eleanor was giving too much to charity. But it was her decision." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And the wine stain on your cufflink, Mr. Grimsby, how did it come about?" Grimsby glanced at his sleeve, startled. I must have spilled some wine during dinner. Clumsy of me." Dr. Leonard Fairfax was the last, his dark eyes unreadable. "I stood by the window," he said. "I counted 12 seconds of darkness. The thud came first, then the scream. I'm certain." Crawley frowned. "You're very precise, Dr. Fairfax, almost as if you were expecting something." Fairfax's lips curved slightly. "I'm an archaeologist, Inspector. Precision is my trade. I observe, I record, I deduce." Miss Marple studied him closely. "And what did you deduce last night, Dr. Fairfax?" He met her gaze. "That someone in that room had a motive strong enough to kill." As the interviews concluded, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her mind a whirl of contradictions. The scream, the thud, the earring, the wine stain, the burned letter. Each was a piece of the puzzle. She thought of old Mr. Thompson in St. Mary Mead, who had lied about a broken clock to hide a theft. "Alibis," she mused, "are only as strong as the truth behind them." Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The mist over Thornfield Manor had thickened by midday, cloaking the estate in a damp, oppressive shroud that mirrored the mood within. The drawing-room, where the guests remained under Inspector Crawley's watchful eye, buzzed with whispered suspicions and sidelong glances. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her armchair, knitted with serene focus, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The tension among the guests was palpable, each one a potential suspect, each one a potential liar. Inspector Crawley,
having concluded his initial interviews, was now focused on a promising lead.
Like a word. In the library, if you please. Charles paled, his hands clenching.
I've told you everything, Inspector. I didn't touch her.
Viola clutched his arm, her voice trembling.
Charles, don't go alone. They're trying to pin this on you.
Miss Marple's needles paused. Miss Redmond, she said softly, it is best to let the inspector do his work. The truth will protect the innocent. Viola's eyes flashed, but she released Charles, who followed Crawley with a defeated slump. The other guests exchanged looks, and Mrs. Wentworth leaned toward Colonel Bantry, whispering, "He's in for it now. The police always go for the air." Bantry grunted. "Nonsense. Charles is a good lad. Bit hot-headed, but no murderer." Miss Marple's lips twitched. She had seen this before in St. Mary Mead, how quickly suspicion settled on the most obvious candidate, like dust on a neglected shelf. Yet she knew the truth often lay beneath such distractions, in the quiet corners others overlooked. In the library, Crawley confronted Charles with the maid's testimony. "You argued with your aunt about the will, Mr. Ashby. You were angry, and you were seated right beside her when the lights went out. Care to explain?" Charles ran a hand through his hair. "Yes, we argued. She was giving away half the estate to some orphanage. I told her it was madness, our family's legacy squandered. But I didn't kill her." "And your movements in the dark?" Crawley pressed. I stood up, maybe, to check on Viola. She was scared. That's all." Crawley's mustache twitched. "We'll see about that. The candlestick's being tested for fingerprints. If yours are on it, Mr. Ashby, you'll have more to explain." As Charles returned to the drawing room, pale and shaken, Miss Marple observed the others. Viola rushed to his side, her concern genuine, but tinged with something else. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. Mrs. Wentworth scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of drama. Colonel Bantry muttered about jumped-up policemen, while Mr. Grimsby stared at his cufflink, the wine stain now cleaned, but still vivid in Miss Marple's memory. Dr. Fairfax, as ever, watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the red herrings that so often clouded a case. Charles was the obvious suspect, too obvious, perhaps. His anger was real, but his shock at the pearl earring, now in police custody, nagged at her. Viola's explanation was plausible, but the earring's position, 2 feet from the candlestick near Lady Eleanor's chair, suggested more than a casual loss. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Wentworth, who was fanning herself dramatically. "Mrs. Wentworth," she said, her voice mild, "you have such a keen eye for detail. Did you notice anything unusual about Miss Redmond's earrings last night? Before the lights went out, I mean." Mrs. Wentworth's fan paused. "Her earrings? Why, yes. They were lovely pearls. I noticed them because they matched her dress so perfectly. Both were in place during dinner, I'm sure." Miss Marple nodded. "And after the lights returned?" Mrs. Wentworth frowned, thinking. "I didn't look closely, but now that you mention it, she was touching her ear as if something was missing. I thought she was just nervous." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. She returned to her seat, her mind racing. If Viola had both earrings during dinner, the loss of one during those 12 seconds was significant. Had she stood as she claimed and lost it in a struggle? Or had someone else removed it, perhaps to cast suspicion on her? The arrival of a constable interrupted her thoughts. He whispered to Crawley, who nodded grimly and addressed the room. "The candlestick's fingerprints are smudged. Useless, I'm afraid. But we found something else. A key hidden in the dining room's chandelier. It's small, likely for a desk or safe." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A key," she murmured. "How very curious." Crawley held up the small brass key, its surface glinting in the firelight. "Does anyone recognize this?" The guests shook their heads, but Miss Marple noted Dr. Fairfax's slight stiffening, a momentary lapse in his composure. A key to what? She wondered. In St. Mary Mead, old Mrs. Blackett had hidden a key in her parlour, fearing theft. It had unlocked a box containing letters that exposed a family secret. This key, Miss Marple thought, will unlock more than a drawer. As Crawley dismissed the group for lunch, under strict instructions to remain on the premises, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting resumed. Charles was the red herring, she was certain. But the true killer was among them, hiding behind a mask of grief or innocence. The key, the earring, the burned letter. These were the threads she would follow, and they would lead her to the truth. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The afternoon at Thornfield Manor was heavy with unease, the mist outside thickening into a drizzle that tapped insistently against the windows. The guests, confined to the drawing room and dining hall under Inspector Crawley's orders, moved restlessly, their polite facades fraying like old lakes. Of observation and deduction. The discovery of the key in the chandelier had shifted the investigation, and she sensed it was a pivotal clue, one that demanded closer scrutiny. Inspector Crawley, ever methodical, had begun searching for the lock the key might fit, focusing on Lady Eleanor's study and bedroom. Miss Marple, however, was more intrigued by the key's placement. Hidden in the chandelier, she mused, her needles clicking softly. A deliberate act, requiring time and intent, not the work of a panicked killer. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where young Emily Carter had hidden a stolen brooch in a flower pot, thinking it clever. The chandelier was no less audacious, but far more calculated. As lunch was served, a subdued affair of cold meats and salad, Miss Marple observed the guests closely. Charles Ashby, still the police's prime suspect, ate little, his eyes darting to Viola, who sat pale and silent. Mrs. Wentworth, ever the dramatist, recounted a tale of a murder in one of her novels, drawing nervous glances from the others. Colonel Bantry grumbled about the inconvenience, while Mr. Grimsby sipped his tea with a frown, his cufflink, now spotless, but not forgotten by Miss Marple. Dr. Fairfax, as usual, was a study in detachment, his dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk. It was a small gesture that caught Miss Marple's attention. Viola's hand, reaching for her teacup, trembled slightly, and her sleeve caught on the edge of the table, revealing a faint bruise on her wrist. It was fleeting, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. A bruise, she thought. Recent, perhaps from last night. A struggle. Or something else. She filed it away, her mind turning to the contradictions in the alibis. After lunch, Miss Marple requested permission to accompany Inspector Crawley to the study, citing her old woman's curiosity. Crawley, accustomed to her uncanny insight, agreed, and they entered the small room where the half-burned letter had been found. The study was orderly, its desk piled with neat stacks of correspondence, a silver inkstand, and a photograph of Charles as a boy. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the fireplace, where the charred remains of the letter still lay. "Inspector," she said, "might we examine the desk? A key hidden in a chandelier suggests a lock of importance, perhaps one Lady Eleanor guarded closely." Crawley nodded, and they searched the desk's drawers. Most were unlocked, containing stationery and household accounts,
but one small drawer, tucked beneath the desktop, was secured with a brass lock that matched the key's size. Crawley inserted the key, and it turned with a satisfying click. Inside was a single document, a handwritten note in Lady Eleanor's elegant script, dated 3 days prior. My dearest Charles, I must speak with you about Viola. Her guardian, Mr. Harrow, has written to me with troubling information. I fear she is not.
Codicil to my will is my precaution, but I pray I am wrong. Meet me privately before the engagement is announced. Eleanor. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A clue, Inspector, and a significant one. This note suggests Lady Eleanor suspected Viola of deceit. And Mr. Harrow, who is he? Crawley frowned, reading the note again. We'll need to trace this Harrow fellow. And Charles, did he know about this? Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps someone else did, and wished to silence Lady Eleanor before she could act. They returned to the drawing-room, where Crawley summoned Viola for questioning. She entered the library, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Redmond, Crawley said, holding up the note. Do you know Mr. Harrow? Viola's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to falter. My guardian, she said. He raised me after my parents died, but I haven't seen him in years. And what might he have told Lady Eleanor? Crawley pressed. I don't know. Viola's voice rose, a note of panic creeping in. He was a private man. He never spoke of his business. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. Miss Redmond, your wrist, there's a bruise. Did it happen last night during the darkness? Viola's hand flew to her sleeve, covering the mark. I bumped it, that's all. On the table when I stood up. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Of course, these things happen. As Viola was dismissed, Miss Marple's mind raced. The bruise, the note, the key, they formed a pattern, but it was incomplete. She thought of Mrs. Fletcher in St. Mary Mead, whose bruise had been no accident but a sign of a hidden struggle. Viola is frightened, she thought. But of what or whom? Later, as the guests gathered for tea, Miss Marple overheard a snatch of conversation between Mrs. Wentworth and Colonel Bantry. I saw her, you know, Mrs. Wentworth whispered, her voice low. Viola, last night, before dinner. She was in the hall, arguing with someone. I couldn't see who, but she looked furious. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. An argument, she murmured. Another thread to follow. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Wentworth privately, but for now she watched and listened, knowing that the smallest detail, a bruise, a word, a glance, could unravel the mystery of Thornfield Manor. Chapter 7. More lies surface. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Thornfield Manor, casting a muted glow over the drawing-room where the guests sat in uneasy silence. The drizzle outside had ceased, but the air remained thick with the damp weight of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the group with her characteristic sharpness, her blue eyes catching every flicker of discomfort. Charles darted nervously. Colonel Bantry's bluster seemed forced. Mrs. Wentworth's fan waved too quickly. Mr. Grimsby's lips were a tight line, and Dr. Fairfax's calm was almost too perfect, like a mask carved from marble. The revelation of the note in Lady Eleanor's desk, hinting at Viola's questionable past, had deepened the suspicion around her, but Miss Marple sensed the truth was more tangled. The bruise on Viola's wrist, Mr. Grimsby's stained cufflink, the argument overheard by Mrs. Wentworth, these were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and she was determined to trace them to their source. Like old Mrs. Pritchard in St. Mary Mead, she thought, who hid her son's gambling debts behind a smile, only to be betrayed by a trembling hand. Someone here is trembling, even if they do not show it. Miss Marple decided to probe further, choosing her moment with care. She approached Mrs. Wentworth, who was perched on a sofa, her notebook open as she scribbled with theatrical flourish. Mrs. Wentworth, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze, your keen eye for drama
is most impressive. You mentioned an argument in the hall before dinner, Viola and a man, you said. Could you recall any specific words? Even the smallest detail might be vital. Mrs. Wentworth's fan paused, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of being consulted. Oh, Miss Marple, it was positively chilling. I was adjusting my scarf in the hall mirror at 6:30. I always note the time, you know, for my stories. Viola's voice was sharp, saying something like, "You can't ruin this for me." The man's voice was lower, almost a growl, muttering about promises kept and debts unpaid. I couldn't see his face, but it wasn't Charles. Too measured, too cold. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. 6:30, she repeated. And you're certain it wasn't Mr. Ashby? Mrs. Wentworth nodded vigorously. Quite certain. Charles has that boyish energy, even when cross. This was sinister. The word hung in the air, and Miss Marple filed it away, her mind turning to the possibilities. An argument about debts and promises, not with Charles, but another man, perhaps Dr. Fairfax, whose calm precision hinted at hidden depths, or even Mr. Grimsby, whose loyalty to Lady Eleanor masked a nervous edge. She thought of St. Mary Mead's Mr. Jenkins, whose whispered threats in a pub had revealed a blackmail scheme. Sinister, she mused, is a word that fits a man with something to hide. Before she could pursue
Fraudulent. Miss Redmond, what did you know of this? Viola's face drained of color, her hands clutching her handkerchief. I knew nothing of fraud, she stammered. Mr. Harrow managed my inheritance. He said it was from my father's investments. Lady Eleanor asked me about it, but I told her everything I knew. Charles stepped forward, his voice sharp with indignation. This is a witch hunt, Inspector. Viola's no criminal. My aunt was prying into things that didn't concern her. Crawley's mustache twitched. And you, Mr. Ashby, argued with your aunt about her will. The codicil cut your inheritance. That's motive enough for some. Before Charles could retort, Mr. Grimsby spoke, his tone icy. If I may, Inspector, you're overlooking the obvious. Lady Eleanor's codicil was my recommendation, to protect the estate from reckless spending. Charles was displeased, but he's no murderer. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the slight tremor in Grimsby's voice. Mr. Grimsby, she said softly, your cufflink last night bore a stain. Wine, you said. Yet your place at the table showed no spill. Could it have been blood, perhaps, from a moment of violence? Grimsby's hand jerked to his sleeve, his face paling. Blood? Absurd. I spilled wine in the dark as I told you. You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's smile was serene but unrelenting. In St. Mary Mead, a young man once claimed a stain was jam, when it was paint from a stolen bicycle. Small lies, Mr. Grimsby. Unravel larger ones. The room tensed, eyes darting between Grimsby and Miss Marple. Dr. Fairfax, silent until now, leaned forward, his voice smooth as polished stone. A fascinating observation, Miss Marple. The stain, the bruise on Miss Redmond's wrist, the scream's timing, these are no coincidences. Someone moved in the dark, and I heard a rustle just before the thud. Fabric, perhaps silk, near the table. Viola's breath caught, and Charles's eyes flashed. Are you accusing her, Fairfax? He demanded. Fairfax's lips curved slightly. I accuse no one. I merely observe, as Miss Marple does. Colonel Bantry snorted, breaking the tension. All this talk of stains and rustles, it's a servant, I tell you. Some disgruntled footman sneaking in to rob the place. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. The key in the chandelier, Colonel, suggests planning, not a thief's impulse. Someone hid it to delay discovery of Lady Eleanor's note, and that someone knew its contents, about Miss Redmond.
Or calm too perfect, his observations too precise, like a St. Mary Mead doctor who had once concealed his own guilt behind a facade of professionalism. As the guests dispersed for dinner, Miss Marple lingered, a gaze on the fire. "The lies are surfacing," she murmured, "and with them, the truth."
Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The evening shadows lengthened across Thornfield Manor, the mist outside giving way to a chill that seeped into the very bones of the old house. In the drawing room, the guests sat in strange silence, their nerves taut as violin strings. The weight of Lady Eleanor's murder, now a day old, pressed heavily on them, and the constant presence of Inspector Crawley's constables only heightened their unease. Miss Jane Marple, the knitting needles moving with quiet precision, observed the group with her usual keenness, sensing that the cracks in their composure were beginning to show. The discovery of the note about Viola's past had deepened the suspicion around her, but Miss Marple was not convinced the answer lay solely with the young heiress. The bruise on Viola's wrist, Mr. Grimsby's wine-stained cufflink, Dr. Fairfax's precise recollection of the scream's timing, these were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly. Like Mrs. Langley's jigsaw in St. Mary Mead, she thought, where one piece was missing until the cat knocked it from under the sofa. The truth is here, waiting to be found. The breaking point came unexpectedly, as such moments often do. Inspector Crawley had returned from telephoning London, his face grim with new information. He gathered the guests, his voice cutting through the room's tension. "I've spoken with Mr. Harrow's office," he announced. "He's confirmed that Lady Eleanor inquired about Miss Redmond's background 3 weeks ago. He sent her a letter detailing irregularities in Miss Redmond's inheritance. It seems her parents' estate was not as straightforward as she claims." Viola gasped, her hands flying to her face. "That's a lie!" she cried, a voice breaking. "My inheritance is mine! Mr. Harrow never told me anything was wrong!" Charles leapt to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous, Inspector! You're accusing Viola based on some vague letter? My aunt trusted her, welcomed her." Crawley raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Ashby. We're not accusing anyone, yet. But Miss Redmond, you'll need to explain why Lady Eleanor felt the need to investigate you." Viola's eyes filled with tears, and she sank into a chair, a composure crumbling. "I don't know," she whispered. "She asked me about my parents, my childhood. I told her everything. I was orphaned at 10, raised by Mr. Harrow. My inheritance came from my father's investments. I never lied." Miss Marple's needles paused, a gaze softening as she watched Viola's distress. The girl's tears were genuine, but there was something in her voice, a quiver of fear, not just grief. "Miss Redmond," Miss Marple said gently, "did Lady Eleanor ever mention this letter to you? Or perhaps confront you about its contents?" Viola shook her head, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "No, but she was different the last few days, distant. She kept looking at me as if she didn't trust me anymore." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Charles knelt beside her, his anger giving way to concern. "Viola, darling, it's all right. They can't prove anything." Mrs. Wentworth, ever the dramatist, fanned herself vigorously. "Oh, it's heartbreaking, like a scene from my Tears of the Innocent, a young girl betrayed by fate." Colonel Bantry snorted. "Nonsense! The girl's upset, but that doesn't make her a killer. Look to the servants, I say, always sneaking about." Mr. Grimsby cleared his throat, his voice cold. "If I may, Inspector, this focus on Miss Redmond seems premature. Lady Eleanor's codicil affected more than just her. Charles, for instance, stood to lose a great deal." Charles whirled on him. "How dare you, Grimsby? You're the one who pushed her to change the will. If anyone had a motive—" "Enough!" Crawley barked, silencing the room. "This squabbling gets us nowhere. Miss Marple, have you anything to add?" Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes scanning the group. "Only this, Inspector. Emotions reveal much.
but they can also obscure. Miss Redmond's distress is real, but so is Mr. Ashby's anger and Mr. Grimsby's defensiveness. We must look beyond the tears to the facts. The bruise on Miss Redmond's wrist, for instance. When did it occur, and how? Viola's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "I told you I bumped it in the dark!" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unwavering. "Perhaps. But bruises tell stories, Miss Redmond. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a young woman who bruised her arm in a struggle she denied. The truth came out in time." The room fell silent. Viola's sobs the only sound. Dr. Fairfax, who had been watching with his usual detachment, spoke at last. "Miss Marple is right," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "Details matter. The bruise, the key, the scream's timing. These are not accidents. Someone in this room knows more than they're saying." His words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in Mr. Grimsby's eyes, the tightening of Colonel Bantry's jaw. She thought of old Mr. Jenkins in St. Mary Mead. Was not as clear as she claimed. The bruise, the argument Mrs. Wentworth overheard, the note from Mr. Harrow, these pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to trust and betrayal. As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Dr. Fairfax. His calm, his precision, his insistence on the scream's timing. They suggested a mind that saw more than he revealed. Like Dr. Hayes, she thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead physician who had hidden his own guilt behind a facade of competence. Dr. Fairfax is watching, she decided. But what is he watching for? The truth, she knew, was close. The emotional cracks were widening, and soon someone would break entirely. Quote. Chapter 9. The Trap. The second evening at Thornfield Manor descended with a chill that matched the growing tension within its walls. The drawing room, once a haven of elegance, now felt like a gilded cage, the guests trapped under the watchful eyes of Inspector Crawley's constables. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, sensed the moment was ripe for action. The clues, the pearl earring, the wine-stained cufflink, the bruise on Viola's wrist, the key in the chandelier, and the burnt letter had woven a complex tapestry, but the pattern was emerging. Like Mrs. Turner's embroidery, she thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead namer whose tangled threads had hidden a perfect design. The truth requires a gentle tug to reveal itself. Miss Marple had shared her observations with Inspector Crawley, suggesting a strategy to unsettle the killer. "We must apply pressure, Inspector," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Gather them all, let them talk, and watch. The guilty will betray themselves, as they always do in moments of strain." Crawley, though skeptical of her methods, agreed. He summoned the guests to the dining room where Lady Eleanor's murder had occurred, a deliberate choice to heighten their discomfort. The table was cleared, but the candlestick's absence was a stark reminder of the crime. The guests filed in, their faces a mix of dread and defiance. Charles Ashby, his jaw tight. Viola Redmond, her eyes red-rimmed. Colonel Bantry, blustering to mask his unease. Mrs. Wentworth, clutching her notebook like a shield. Mr. Grimsby, his lips a thin line, and Dr. Fairfax, as composed as ever, his dark eyes scanning the room. Crawley stood at the head of the table, his moustache bristling. "We're close to the truth," he declared, "but someone here is hiding it. I want each of you to recount your movements during those 12 seconds of darkness, one last time. Miss Marple will assist me in noting any inconsistencies." Miss Marple sat to one side, her knitting in her lap, her expression serene, but her mind alert. She knew the killer was among them, and this gathering was her trap, designed to provoke a slip. The human heart, she thought, cannot bear scrutiny forever. Charles spoke first, his voice strained.
I was seated, as I said. I reached for Viola's hand when the lights went out. I heard the scream, then the thud. I didn't move until the lights came back. Viola, her hands trembling, followed. I stood up, I think, when it went dark. I was frightened. I heard the thud, then I screamed. My earring must have fallen then. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. And your bruise, Miss Redmond? You said it was from bumping the table, yet it's on your wrist, not your arm. Viola's eyes widened, but she held her ground. I don't know. It happened in the confusion.
Scream first, then the thud. Damned if I know who did it, but it wasn't me.
Mrs. Wentworth, ever theatrical, sighed dramatically. I was seated, fanning myself. The scream came before the thud, I'm sure of it. I noted the time, 8:47, just as the clock chimed. Mr. Grimsby adjusted his spectacles. His tone clipped. I remained in my chair. Thud first, then the scream. I saw nothing, heard nothing else. Dr. Fairfax leaned back, his voice smooth. I stood by the window, counting the seconds. Thud, then scream. A rustle of fabric just before the thud, near the table. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The contradictions were stark. Scream before thud, or thud before scream. The rustle, the bruise, the earring, all pointed to movement in the dark. But whose? She leaned forward, her voice gentle but piercing. Let us consider the candlestick. It was heavy, requiring a strong grip. Yet Miss Redmond's bruise suggests a struggle, and Mr. Grimsby, your cufflink, cleaned now but stained with wine last night. Could it have been blood, perhaps mistaken in the dim light? Grimsby's face paled, his hand jerking to his sleeve. Blood? Preposterous. It was wine, as I said. Charles rounded on him. You've been against me from the start, Grimsby. Did you frame Viola to protect the estate? Or was it you who struck my aunt? Grimsby's eyes flashed. How dare you? I served Lady Eleanor loyally for years. Viola sobbed, her voice breaking. Stop it, all of you! I didn't do anything! I loved her! Mrs. Wentworth gasped, scribbling furiously, while Colonel Bantry muttered about unseemly accusations. Dr. Fairfax remained silent, but his gaze locked on Grimsby, a faint smile playing at his lips. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice cutting through the chaos. Let us consider the key in the chandelier. It unlocked a note revealing Lady Eleanor's suspicions about Miss Redmond. Who hid it there, and why? To protect a secret, or to cast blame? The question hung in the air, and Miss Marple watched closely. Grimsby's fingers twitched, Viola's tears stopped abruptly, and Charles's face darkened. Dr. Fairfax's smile widened, almost imperceptibly. Someone, Miss Marple thought, is feeling the net tighten. Crawley seized the moment. We've sent for Mr. Harrow. He arrives tomorrow with documents about Miss Redmond's past. If anyone knows more, speak now. The silence was deafening, broken only by Viola's sharp intake of breath. I have nothing to hide, she whispered, but her eyes darted to Charles, then away. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Their alibis now riddled with cracks, Miss Marple lingered, her mind tracing the threads. The bruise, the key, the rustle, the stain. One of these would lead to the killer, and she was determined to find it before Mr. Harrow's arrival tipped the balance. The reveal. The morning of the third day at Thornfield Manor broke, with a feeble sun struggling through the dissipating mist, casting pale light across the dining room, where the guests were once again assembled. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of Inspector Crawley's promise that Mr. Harrow's arrival would bring clarity to Viola Redmond's past, hanging over them like a storm cloud. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual armchair with her knitting bag at her side, appeared as serene as ever, but her sharp blue eyes gleamed with the certainty that the moment of truth had arrived. Like the final act of a village play, she thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead performance where the villain's mask had slipped in the last scene. The denouement is upon us. Inspector Crawley stood at the head of the table, his mustache bristling with authority. Beside him was a stern-looking man in his 50s, introduced as Mr. Harrow, Viola's former guardian. His briefcase, clutched tightly, hinted at documents that might unravel the mystery. The guests, Charles Ashby, Viola Redmond, Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Wentworth, Mr. Grimsby, and Dr. Fairfax, sat in tense silence, their faces a gallery of fear, defiance, and curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawley began, "Mr. Harrow has brought information that sheds light on Lady Eleanor's concerns. But before we proceed, Miss Marple has requested to speak. She has insights to share." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her small figure commanding the room's attention. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The murder of Lady Eleanor Ashby was no impulsive act, but a carefully planned crime, rooted in secrets and betrayal. Let us reconstruct those fatal 12 seconds at 8:47 p.m., when the lights went out, and see how the pieces fit." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. The candlestick, heavy and silver, struck Lady Eleanor with force, causing a fatal blow to her temple. The key, hidden in the chandelier, unlocked a note revealing her suspicions about Miss Redmond's past. A pearl earring was found near the candlestick, and a wine stain, perhaps blood, marked Mr. Grimsby's cufflink. A bruise on Miss Redmond's wrist suggested a struggle, and a rustle of fabric was heard just before the thud. These are our threads, and they weave a clear pattern. Charles shifted uneasily, while Viola's hands clenched her handkerchief. Grimsby's lips tightened, and Dr. Fairfax's gaze remained steady, almost by the window. Yet the candlestick's position, 2 feet from Lady Eleanor's chair, suggests the killer was close, within arm's reach. The scream, as Dr. Fairfax noted, followed the thud, indicating the blow came first, and someone reacted. But who? She turned to Viola. "Miss Redmond, your earring was found near the candlestick, and your bruise suggests a struggle. You claimed to have stood in fright, losing the earring in the dark. But earrings do not fall so precisely, nor do bruises appear without cause. I believe you were involved in a scuffle, not with Lady Eleanor, but with someone else." Viola's eyes widened, but Miss Marple pressed on, her voice relentless. "Mr. Grimsby, your cufflink bore a stain, which you claimed was wine. Yet the tablecloth near your place was spotless, and you cleaned the cufflink quickly. Was it blood, perhaps, from a struggle you wished to conceal?" Grimsby's face paled. "I told you it was wine. I spilled it in the dark." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And yet, the rustle of fabric Dr. Fairfax heard suggests movement. Someone reaching across the table, perhaps, to strike or to grab. Let us consider the note, found in the locked drawer. It revealed Lady Eleanor's doubts about Miss Redmond, prompted by Mr. Harrow's letter. Someone hid the key in the chandelier to delay its discovery. Why? To protect a secret, or to shift blame? She turned to Mr. Harrow, who nodded gravely.
Lady Eleanor asked me to verify Miss Redmond's inheritance, he said. I discovered her father's investments were tied to a fraudulent scheme, long concealed. She stood to lose everything if exposed. Viola gasped, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Miss Redmond, I do not believe you killed Lady Eleanor. Your fear is real, but it is fear of exposure, not guilt. The true killer is someone who knew of the note and feared its revelation, not for Viola's sake, but for their own. Her gaze settled on Mr. Grimsby. Mr. Grimsby, you were Lady Eleanor's solicitor, privy to her concerns. You drafted the codicil, reducing Charles's inheritance, but you also knew of Mr. Harrow's letter. You were seated near Lady Eleanor, within reach of the candlestick. The stain on your cufflink was not wine, but blood, from a struggle with Viola, who
on Grimsby. His face crumbled, and he sank back into his chair, his hands shaking. I didn't mean to kill her, he whispered. She was going to confront me, ruin me. I panicked. Viola sobbed, and Charles gripped her hand, his anger replaced by relief. Mrs. Wentworth gasped, scribbling furiously, while Colonel Bantry muttered, "Good God!" Dr. Fairfax's smile was gone, replaced by a nod of respect. Crawley stepped forward, his voice firm. "Percival Grimsby, you're under arrest for the murder of Lady Eleanor Ashby." As the constables led Grimsby away, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. "The truth," she said softly, "is always in the details. A stain, a bruise, a hidden key. They tell the story, if one listens." Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning sun had finally burned away the last of the mist over Thornfield Manor, casting a soft golden light through the drawing-room windows. The oppressive tension that had gripped the house for 2 days was lifting, replaced by a quiet relief tinged with melancholy. Mr. Grimsby's confession had brought the truth to light, but the shadow of Lady Eleanor's death lingered, a reminder of the fragility of trust. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, her serene expression masking the sharp mind that had unraveled the mystery. The guests, no longer confined, were preparing to depart. Charles Ashby and Viola Redmond stood close, their hands entwined, their faces a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. Colonel Bantry, his bluster softened, was regaling a constable with tales of his military days. Mrs. Wentworth, her notebook filled with the drama of the past days, was already spinning ideas for her next novel. Dr. Fairfax, ever enigmatic, stood by the window, his dark eyes thoughtful. Inspector Crawley, his moustache less bristling now, approached Miss Marple with a respectful nod. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "I'd have pinned it on young Ashby or Miss Redmond if you hadn't pointed out that cufflink and the key. How do you do it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she folded her knitting. "It is simply a matter of observation, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, I have learned that people are much the same, whether in a village or a grand manor. A glance, a gesture, a lie. They betray the heart's secrets. Mr. Grimsby's stain was not wine, but blood, and his haste to clean it spoke of guilt. The key in the chandelier—"
Suspicion. Charles approached, Viola at his side. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we owe you everything. If you hadn't seen through Grimsby's lies, Viola and I—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Viola's eyes were bright with tears. "I was so afraid you'd think I did it. Lady Eleanor was kind to me, despite her doubts. I'll never forget what you've done." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, the truth is a great healer. You and Mr. Ashby have a future to build. Do not let this shadow dim it." As the couple moved away, Dr. Fairfax approached, his expression unreadable. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Marple," he said. "I confess, I suspected Grimsby, but I lacked your clarity. The rustle of fabric I heard was the key, wasn't it? He hid it as he struck." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely, Dr. Fairfax. Your precision was most helpful. The human heart is a puzzle, but the smallest details, a rustle, a stain, a hidden key, reveal its workings." Mrs. Wentworth swept over, her notebook clutched to her chest. "Miss Marple, this will be my greatest novel yet. Murder at the Manor, I'll call it. You must let me dedicate it to you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I am flattered, Mrs. Wentworth, but I prefer the quiet of St. Mary Mead to literary fame. Write your story, but remember, truth is stranger than fiction." As the guests began to disperse, their bags packed and carriages arranged, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her gaze drifting to the portrait of Lady Eleanor above the fireplace. She thought of her own village, where secrets were hidden in teacups and garden chats, no less deadly than those in grand manors. People, she mused, are driven by the same passions, greed, fear, love, and it is in understanding those passions that we find the truth. Inspector Crawley offered to escort her to the station, but Miss Marple declined, preferring to walk through the grounds one last time. The air was fresh, the lawns glistening with dew. She paused by an ancient oak, her mind reflecting on the case. Grimsby's greed led him to betrayal, she thought, but it was his fear of exposure that undid him, like Mr. Thompson in St. Mary Mead, who stole from the church fund and thought no one would notice. The little grey cells, as my friend M. Poirot might say, see what others overlook. With a final glance at Thornfield Manor, its stone facade now bathed in sunlight, Miss Marple turned toward the village station, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. The mystery was solved, the guilty exposed, and the innocent freed. "And now," she murmured, a faint smile on her lips, "for a quiet cup of tea in St. Mary Mead." The unsettled past. The departure of the guests,
Grimsby into custody, his confession still echoing in the minds of those who remained. Miss Jane Marple, however, lingered at the manor, her departure delayed by a quiet request from Charles Ashby. He had approached her as she packed her knitting bag, his face drawn but determined. "Miss Marple," he had said, "there's something more. Viola's still frightened, and I don't think it's just about Grimsby. Will you stay a little longer?" Miss Marple, her intuition stirred, had agreed. Now, seated in the library with a cup of tea, she observed Charles and Viola, who sat across from her on a velvet settee. The room was quiet, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the distant ticking of the hall clock. Viola's hands twisted her handkerchief, and Charles's eyes held a mix of protectiveness and unease. "Something troubles you both," Miss Marple said gently, her voice as soothing as the tea. "Speak freely, my dears. The truth, once begun, must be followed to its end." Viola's eyes met Miss Marple's, brimming with unshed tears. "It's my past," she whispered. "Mr. Harrow's letter, Lady Eleanor's suspicions. I thought it was over with Grimsby's arrest, but I'm afraid there's more. I didn't tell everything." Charles squeezed her hand. "You don't have to, Viola. Whatever it is, I don't care. But I do."
Viola said, her voice breaking. Miss Marple, my inheritance, it's true there were irregularities. My father was involved in a scheme, something dishonest. Mr. Harrow covered it up to protect me, but Lady Eleanor found out. I was terrified she'd expose me, ruin my engagement. Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, remained still. And did you tell Lady Eleanor this, Miss Redmond? Viola nodded, her voice barely audible. The night before the dinner in the hall, Mrs. Wentworth overheard us. I begged Lady Eleanor not to tell Charles, to give me a chance. She promised to think it over, but she was so distant. I thought she'd tell everyone. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And the bruise on your wrist? Viola hesitated, then pulled back her sleeve, revealing the faint mark. It was Grimsby. During the darkness, I felt someone move past me, toward Lady Eleanor. I grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. I didn't know why, just instinct. He pushed me away hard. That's when I screamed after the thud. Charles's face darkened. That scoundrel! If I'd known! Miss Marple raised a hand. Peace, Mr. Ashby. Miss Redmond's courage helped reveal the truth, though she did not know it at the time.
Away. Miss Marple's mind raced, recalling the half-burned letter. Cannot continue. Betrayal. Charles must know. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where old Mrs. Cleary had uncovered a family secret by piecing together fragments of gossip. A connection, she murmured. We must speak with Mr. Harrow. Inspector Crawley, summoned by a telephone call, arrived with Mr. Harrow, who had remained in the village to assist the police. The solicitor, stern and precise, set his briefcase on the library table. Miss Marple, he said, I understand you solved the murder, but Miss Redmond's concerns require clarity. Lady Eleanor's inquiry into Viola's past uncovered a link to Dr. Leonard Fairfax. Viola gasped, and Charles's eyes widened. Fairfax, he said. What's he got to do with this? Mr. Harrow opened his briefcase, producing a document. Viola's father, James Redmond, was involved in a fraudulent investment scheme in Egypt, where Dr. Fairfax was excavating 20 years ago. Fairfax, then a young archaeologist, was a silent partner, using his academic credentials to lend legitimacy to the scheme. When it collapsed, Redmond took the blame, and Fairfax escaped scrutiny. Lady Eleanor, through my investigation, discovered this connection. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And Dr. Fairfax was at Thornfield, a guest at the dinner? Did Lady Eleanor confront him? Harrow nodded. She wrote to me, asking for confirmation. I believe she intended to speak with him privately, but Grimsby, aware of the investigation, acted first to protect his own secrets. Miss Marple turned to Viola. Your fear, my dear, was not just of exposure, but of this link to Fairfax. You sensed danger, didn't you? Viola nodded, tears spilling. I didn't know it was him, but I felt watched. His eyes, always so cold. Charles wrapped an arm around her. It's over now, Viola. Fairfax can't hurt you. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Dr. Fairfax is no murderer, but his presence here was no coincidence. He came to ensure his past remained buried. We must inform Inspector Crawley. As Harrow left to fetch the inspector, Miss Marple reflected on the layers of deceit. Like the vicarage garden, she thought, where weeds hide beneath roses. Fairfax's secret was not the murder, but it was the spark that set Grimsby's fear alight. The truth, though painful, had freed Viola and Charles to face their future. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead, where new secrets no doubt awaited her keen observation. Chapter 13. The Hidden Motive. The library at Thornfield Manor was bathed in the soft light of late morning, the sun filtering through the tall windows and casting intricate patterns on the polished floor.
Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting. Her knee
Fairfax's connection to Viola Redmond's past
had added a new layer to the mystery, one that, while not directly tied to Lady Eleanor's murder, hinted at deeper currents of deceit. Like the undercurrents in St. Mary Mead's river, she thought, recalling how a quiet stream had once hidden a stolen locket. The surface is calm, but the depths hold secrets. Inspector Crawley, summoned by Mr. Harrow's disclosure, had called Dr. Fairfax to the library for questioning. The archaeologist entered with his characteristic composure, his dark eyes cool and unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. Charles and Viola, at Miss Marple's suggestion, were present, their faces a mix of apprehension and resolve. Mr. Harrow stood by the desk, his briefcase open, the incriminating documents neatly arranged. "Dr. Fairfax," Crawley began, his voice stern, "Mr. Harrow has informed us of your involvement in a fraudulent scheme with Viola Redmond's father, James Redmond, 20 years ago in Egypt. Lady Eleanor discovered this through her inquiries. Care to explain why you were at Thornfield?" Fairfax's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained guarded. "I was invited, Inspector, as a guest to celebrate Charles and Viola's engagement. My past with James Redmond is irrelevant. Ancient history, quite literally." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And yet, Dr. Fairfax, Lady Eleanor's letter to Mr. Harrow suggests she suspected your involvement. She was a meticulous woman, unlikely to invite you without purpose. Did she confront you about your past?" Fairfax's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "She mentioned a passing interest in my Egyptian work, nothing more. I assumed it was polite curiosity." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle but probing. "Curiosity, Dr. Fairfax, can be dangerous. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a man, Mr. Collins, who asked too many questions about a neighbour's finances and found himself ostracized. Lady Eleanor's questions were not idle, were they? You came to Thornfield to ensure her silence, perhaps not with murder, but with persuasion." Fairfax's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. Mr. Harrow interjected, producing a letter from his briefcase. "This is a copy of my correspondence with Lady Eleanor," he said. "She asked specifically about your role in the Redmond scheme. She believed you had profited illicitly and feared you might influence Charles or Viola." Charles's face darkened. "You knew my aunt was on to you, Fairfax. Did you have anything to do with her death?" Fairfax raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "I assure you, Mr. Ashby, I did not. Grimsby's confession proves he acted alone, driven by his own greed. My presence here was precautionary. I wish to clarify any misunderstandings with Lady Eleanor." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Precautionary, Dr. Fairfax."
Of fabric. These suggest a man accustomed to covering his tracks. You heard Grimsby move in the dark, didn't you? And you chose not to act, perhaps because his crime served your purpose. The room fell silent, Fairfax's composure cracking ever so slightly. "You have a vivid imagination, Miss Marple," he said, but his voice lacked its usual smoothness. Crawley leaned forward. "We'll be looking into your finances, Fairfax. If there's any truth to Lady Eleanor's suspicions, we'll find it." Viola, who had been silent, spoke at last, her voice trembling but resolute. "Dr. Fairfax, did you know my father? Did you ruin him?" Fairfax met her gaze, his expression softening for the first time. "Your father was a good man, Miss Redmond, but naive. He trusted the wrong people, myself included. I profited, yes, but I did not intend his downfall. When Lady Eleanor invited me, I came to make amends, not to harm." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Amends, Dr. Fairfax, are rarely so simple. Your silence during the murder suggests you saw an opportunity to escape scrutiny. But the truth, like a seed in St. Mary Mead's soil,
always finds its way to the light.
Crawley dismissed Fairfax, warning him to remain available for further questioning. As the archaeologist left, his steps measured but heavy, Miss Marple turned to Viola and Charles. "Your past, Miss Redmond, is no longer a chain. Dr. Fairfax's role, while shameful, did not lead to murder. Grimsby's greed was the spark, but Lady Eleanor's curiosity set the stage." Charles squeezed Viola's hand. "It's over, Viola. We'll start fresh. No secrets." Viola nodded, her eyes still haunted but hopeful. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've given us a future." As the couple left, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind reflecting on the hidden motives that had surfaced. Like old Mrs. Hartnell's diary, she thought, where every entry hid a truth behind a lie. Fairfax's motive was self-preservation, not murder, but it wove into the tapestry of this tragedy. With the mystery's threads nearly unraveled, Miss Marple knew one final piece remained, ensuring justice for Lady Eleanor's memory. She resolved to speak with Crawley before departing, her heart already longing for the quiet of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The afternoon light filtered through the library windows of Thornfield Manor, casting a warm glow over the oak-paneled walls and the rows of leather-bound books. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her side, her needles resting for the moment as she sipped a cup of tea. The resolution of Lady Eleanor's murder and the revelation of Dr. Fairfax's connection to Viola,
where a single missing square left the pattern incomplete. Inspector Crawley, his investigation nearing its close, had joined her in the library, his notebook filled with the details of Mr. Grimsby's confession and Dr. Fairfax's questionable past. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her, "you've been a godsend in this case. Grimsby's in custody, and we're looking into Fairfax's finances. But is there anything else? You've a knack for seeing what I miss." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled over the rim of her teacup. "You are kind, Inspector. The case is solved, but there are small matters that linger. The human heart, you see, is rarely content with half-truths. I wonder, for instance, about the argument Mrs. Wentworth overheard in the hall before dinner. Viola admitted to speaking with Lady Eleanor, but Mrs. Wentworth described a man's voice. Was it truly Charles, or someone else?" Crawley's moustache twitched. "You think there's more to it? We've got our man in Grimsby." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "Grimsby killed Lady Eleanor to protect his embezzlement, fearing her investigation into Viola's past would expose him. But the argument in the hall suggests another layer, a tension that may not involve murder, but still matters to those left behind." She rose, her movements sprightly despite her age, and suggested a walk through the manor's grounds. "Fresh air, Inspector, often clears the mind, and I believe Charles and Viola may benefit from a final conversation." They found the couple in the rose garden, where the late summer blooms were beginning to fade. Charles was pacing, his hands in his pockets, while Viola sat on a stone bench, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple approached, a smile warm. "My dears," she said, "the truth has freed you from suspicion, but I sense a shadow remains. Miss Redmond, you spoke with Lady Eleanor in the hall before dinner, but Mrs. Wentworth heard a man's voice. Was it Charles or another?" Viola's eyes widened, and she glanced at Charles, who stopped pacing. "It was me," he said quickly. "I was with Viola, discussing the engagement. Aunt Eleanor was concerned about the codicil."
Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Yet Mrs. Wentworth described the voice as low and urgent. "Not like yours, Mr. Ashby. In St. Mary Mead, I once overheard a quarrel, and mistook the speaker because of my assumptions. Could it have been Dr. Fairfax, perhaps, speaking with Lady Eleanor?" Viola's hands trembled, and she looked away. It was Fairfax, she admitted, her voice.
"I was afraid," Viola said, tears welling. "After Lady Eleanor's death, I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. I didn't want to make things worse." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind, but resolute. "Dr. Fairfax's pass with your father, Miss Redmond, gave him reason to fear exposure. He argued with Lady Eleanor to dissuade her from pursuing her inquiries, not knowing Grimsby would act first. His silence during the murder was not complicity, but self-preservation." Crawley scribbled in his notebook. "I'll have another word with Fairfax. He's got questions to answer, even if he's not the killer." Miss Marple turned to Charles and Viola. "You must trust each other now," she said. "Secrets, even small ones, can fester. Lady Eleanor's death was a tragedy, but it has cleared the way for your future. Do not let fear cloud it." Charles took Viola's hand, his expression softening. "You're right, Miss Marple. We'll face everything together, past and future." As they walked back to the manor, Miss Marple lingered by the roses, her mind reflecting on the case. Like the garden club in St. Mary Mead, she thought, where a single weed could spoil the display. One hidden truth can disrupt the harmony. Fairfax's secret was not the murder, but it wove into the tapestry of deceit. She joined Crawley in the hall, where he was preparing to question Fairfax again. "Inspector," she said, "Dr. Fairfax is unlikely to confess to fraud, but his argument with Lady Eleanor confirms his motive for silence. The truth, as always, lies in the details. A whispered word, a hidden key, a moment of fear." Crawley nodded, a rare smile breaking through. "You're a wonder, Miss Marple. I'll see this through, and Fairfax won't slip away." As the inspector moved off, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag, her thoughts turning to St. Mary Mead. The manor's secrets were nearly all unravelled, and she felt the quiet pull of home. "One more day," she murmured, "to ensure the tapestry is complete." Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The final morning at Thornfield Manor dawned clear and bright, the sun casting long rays across the estate's lawns, banishing the last traces of the mist that had shrouded it for days. The grandeur of the house seemed restored, as if Lady Eleanor's spirit had found peace with the unmasking of her killer. Miss Jane Marple stood in the hall, a modest suitcase packed, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The events of the past days, the murder, the secrets, the revelations, had woven a tapestry of human frailty, now neatly stitched by the truth.
Confessed fully. And we're building a case against Fairfax for his part in the old fraud. Your eye for detail, well, it's unmatched. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You are too kind, Inspector. I merely observe what others overlook. The human heart is a curious thing, full of contradictions. Mr. Grimsby's greed, Dr. Fairfax's shame, Miss Redmond's fear, they all played their part. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen such passions in smaller settings, but the pattern is the same." Crawley nodded, a rare warmth in his expression. "You'll be back to your village then. No more mysteries for a while." Miss Marple chuckled softly,
Oh, Inspector, mysteries are never far away. A misplaced letter, a whispered word. St. Mary Mead has its own secrets. But I shall enjoy a quiet cup of tea first.
Charles Ashby and Viola Redmond approached, their faces lighter than they had been in days. Charles clasped Miss Marple's hand, his voice earnest.
We can't thank you enough, Miss Marple. You saved us, Viola, me, our future. Thornfield will be ours now, and we'll honor Aunt Eleanor's memory.
Viola, her eyes clear of tears, added,
I was so afraid my past would ruin everything. You saw the truth, not just about the murder, but about me. I'll never forget that.
Miss Marple's smile was warm.
My dears, the past shapes us, but it need not bind us. You have each other, and that is a strength no secret can undo. Live honestly, and Thornfield will be a home again.
As they stepped back, Mrs. Wentworth swept in, a velvet cap replaced by a flamboyant scarf. Miss Marple, my novel is taking shape. Murder at the Manor will be a sensation, and I insist on mentioning you, a mysterious lady sleuth knitting her way to the truth. Miss Marple laughed, a rare melodic sound.
Write your story, Mrs. Wentworth, but leave me as a shadow. Fame is for others. I prefer my garden and my neighbours.
Colonel Bantry, lingering nearby, gave a gruff nod. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. Thought it was a servant at first, but you saw right through it. Damned fine work. Dr. Fairfax, who had been questioned again by Crawley, stood apart, his expression subdued. He met Miss Marple's gaze and inclined his head slightly. You've a formidable mind, Miss Marple. I underestimate it.
Chimed late and revealed the thief. The little things always tell the story. As the taxi neared the station, Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her thoughts turning to her garden, her neighbors, and the inevitable secrets that awaited her. The world is full of mysteries, she murmured, a faint smile on her lips, and I shall be ready for the next.